somebody's on.
Hey, this is Kit. I just joined.
Hi,
So,
Kit, it's Toby.
hey, so just so folks know, you will have the option of muting and unmuting yourself. And I'm going to probably mute, well, when we get a bunch of people on, I have a little script to go through. So,
right. So I'm looking at the Ring Central. I'm looking at the Ring Central page. Do I have to log in?
So there are basically two ways you can, when you launch the webinar, it should prompt you to download the application. The software.
Download the app.
And then you just enter the meeting ID, which is 503-820-2422 on the prompt.
Let's see what happens.
And then you should join. If privileges are restricted, you can use the web-based app, but you won't be able to share your screen. So that's kind of why I have the backup of your slides, but ideally one or both or the other of you, between you and Chris, would be able to.
Yeah, Chris is much better at these things than I am.
Well, I had one of the IT guys download the app onto my desktop, my laptop, pardon me, and it didn't require him to do any admin passwords. So maybe this is.
Well, I didn't either yesterday, but now I just tried to put it in my applications, and it requires a password.
Kit, do you want me to see if I can share my screen?
Yeah. So, Chris, if you want to do that, at the bottom of the screen, you know, there's just a share button.
Yeah. Let me see if I can.
It's green. So if you click on that, then you should take over. So there you go.
Ooh. Oh, look at that.
So
let's see if it'll. Okay, so that looks okay.
Yeah.
There's not. I got a little window of. What's this app called again? Ring Central. I've got a little Ring Central window. If that's not in your way or anything.
No, I think you can. I mean, I have the same thing. You can minimize stuff.
Okay.
The user side can minimize stuff. So.
Yeah, it seems to be working fine for me, Toby. If you need me to drive, you could see my slides, Toby?
I could see your slide. It's blank now. It went
yeah,
blank.
I stopped sharing.
Okay, yeah, if you don't mind driving, because I don't seem to have a button that says I don't have a button that says I can take over or share.
Yeah, that won't be a problem at all.
Okay. And then, am I doing the summary at the end?
If you'd like, yeah. Right now we've got, it looks like a pretty good balance of slides. If you want me to just go ahead and push all the way through the end rather than handing it back to you for 2 slides at the end, that seems like it would make sense to just.
I think it would make a lot of sense.
Okay, we'll just do that then. Last year, I think last year we switched at the end because a lot of the forward-looking stuff that we were including for the first time was physical. Right. But since we're not structuring it the same way this time, it seems like it makes sense to do it just one handoff and call it good. Okay. Great. And I'm just looking at my slides here. I got a couple comments, but I think I'm okay. Oh, you didn't change anything in the slides I'm presenting, right? Just in yours? Nope. Just I just moved one slide up into the biological side. Great. Dragonite, J-scope, snow water equivalent, snowpack, Streamflow, and you take over. Okay, I'm good.
you should see that. So you can always raise your hand and try to get my attention. So doing all this stuff, and but it's less crucial perhaps than in our past practice where you were unable to control your mute and unmute. But if, for example, you can't get a word in edgewise, you can do that and maybe get some attention. So at this point, just similar in the past, if you join by phone, there is a participant ID. It's, I believe, a 2-digit number that you need to enter after you've plugged in, dialed in, and entered the webinar ID and so on. Without entering that, you'll be able to hear, but you won't be able to, we won't be able to hear you. Your audio won't be working. So you'll essentially, without entering that, you'll be in a listen-only mode. If you have any technical issues, Chris Kleinschmidt on our staff, he's at least going to be around for the start of the webinar. He's joined from his office. His phone number is 503-820-2412. So if you're having problems, you can give him a call. I started recording this meeting, so it will be recorded, and I think that includes any chats that are part of the this meeting, and we'll make the recording available on request. We'll figure out how to get that file to you if you're interested in reliving this experience. So I have the agenda up. You should be seeing it on your screens, and I think at this point I'll turn the meeting over to the chair of the Ecosystem Workgroup, Yvonne de Renier, and let her run through what's going to be covered today and take it from there. So if you're prepared to do that, Yvonne, I'll unmute you and see if you're there.
Thanks, Kit. I will admit that I'm having some navigation difficulties, minor, with the controls here. So if I am not as together as I should be, it's because I'm trying to figure out how to work this software. But anyway, it looks like from the Ecosystem Workgroup, we have Corey Niles, Jessica Watson. I'm sort of scrolling down to participants. Travis Bach. Those are 3 coastal states. We do not yet have Tim Copeland or Tommy Moore. Is that correct? Okay, and Josh Lindsay said he would be a little bit late, so, but we should get started because we have a bunch of folks from the public on, and we have I wouldn't say it's a tight schedule, but we have a schedule, so. So what we're going to be talking about today is just trying to catch each other up and catch the public up on what we're working on for the March Council meeting. And the Ecosystem Workgroup has been working on draft fishery ecosystem plan outline as the council had requested in September. And at 2:30, we wanted to be more precise about time so that we could make sure that folks who were interested in and or reporting on the California current ecosystem status report would have a firm time. So at 2:30, we'll be hearing from Chris Harvey and Toby Garfield of the Northwest and Southwest Fisheries Science Centers, respectively, on the state of our wonderful ecosystem. And then the last agenda item is to think about next steps for the Climate and Communities Initiative. And this is next steps from the ecosystem work group's perspective, not necessarily from the council's perspective. So does anyone have any requests or questions or changes to the agenda that they want to discuss?
This is Kit. I was just going to mention, Yvonne, depending on how you've logged into the webinar, and I was, you can share your screen. You should be able to share your screen, but if you're having problems doing that, I don't know if you intended to go over any of the draft documents on the Google Drive that the EWG is working on. And if you do and you can't share your screen, I could share that. It's totally up to you.
Okay, thank you. I am having a little bit of trouble with, oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm not. Let's see. Okay, Kit, I had sent everyone a Microsoft Word version of the draft fishery ecosystem plan, and until a second ago, I was having trouble getting that up on my screen, but it looks like I'm okay. And it looks like Tom joined us, and Josh seems to be on also, so good. All right, so I think if there are no objections to just rolling right into the agenda, we should do that. And then does that mean that you need to, do I need to share my screen?
Yeah, if you want to do that, there, so
Okay.
you should see a share button, and you can just take over. I'm not much of a gatekeeper here.
Okay. So. Well, it says that I cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. So I think you have to maybe unshare and then.
Let me figure out how to do that. And okay. Or so I've stopped sharing my screen. See if you can.
Okay. Let's see. It's like we're seeing Kit's kitty. All right. Is everybody seeing a Microsoft Word document?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So just to catch all of you up and remind ourselves of what we're doing and where we are, at the September council meeting, the council reviewed draft chapters 1 and 2, and chapter 1 is sort of the visionary language for the fishery ecosystem plan, including the purpose and the goals and objectives. And chapter 2 is more of a process chapter about when the council will discuss different issues and whatnot, and summaries of ecosystem initiatives and that sort of thing, and the schedule for the ecosystem status reports. We're not going to go over those today. We made them available in October to the public up on the council's website. And I put a link at the top of the screen, but they are available in the council's March 2020 briefing book at agenda item G2 attachment 1. If you want to look them over at this meeting, and Kit, stop me if I'm wrong, the council is going to review and finalize those chapters and then think about what they want to do with the rest of the chapters of the fishery ecosystem plan. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, good. So at any rate, if you want to have comments on those, that would be great. And it would be great if you would provide those to the council at the March meeting. So scrolling on to the rest of the chapters of the fishery ecosystem plan, we over the winter have had a lot of email and documents flying back and forth and trying to figure out, you know, what sort of questions we might have for the council about the rest of the document. And if you're familiar with the fishery ecosystem plan, you may know that Chapter 3 is it's the biggest chapter, and it's sort of our description of the ecosystem. And so we gave a lot of thought to what this chapter might need to look like now, given that we now have a good library of ecosystem status reports from past years, which we did not have when the council adopted the fishery ecosystem plan. So we have a lot more familiarity with the ecosystem, and there's also been a lot of technological changes since then. So there's information that we can maybe provide in online appendices without necessarily providing it all in one chunky PDF document. So our thought was that we still thought it would be useful to have an actual fishery ecosystem plan, you know, paper document that if you were so inclined, you could print it out. But we would move some of the tables and figures and whatnot into online appendices. So Kit Dahl, who, as you know, is our staff officer for ecosystems, is also the staff officer for highly migratory species. And he shared with us the example of the highly migratory species SAFE document, stock assessment and fishery evaluation report, which has a lot of online information and that is updated as soon as you look at it. So it's great. And the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment has a lot of indicators and information available on their website. So we have a lot of really good resources, and then we also have Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission and all of their changes to the PACFIN database and how they're presenting that information since then. So we're sort of thinking about how to combine, you know, a hard PDF document with online appendices, with the, you know, both to provide updated information to the public, but also to sort of make our hard document thinner. So at any rate, for each of our major chapters, we have some questions that we'll be asking the council. And the one for Chapter 3 that we really have to think about, and this is tied to the Magnuson-Stevens Act's guidance for fishery management plans and to the National Environmental Policy Act's guidance on geographic range of action. So last time we did the fishery ecosystem plan, we asked the council, you know, do you want to just do the exclusive economic zone? Are we going to move up into the rivers or move farther offshore? And so we're posing that question again for the council. Do they want to keep the same geographic range, which was and is the West Coast EEZ? And we're recommending that we do, but we wanted to give them that option. So then from there, the outline is going to just, it's consolidating some of the ideas that we have in the existing Chapter 3, and where we address, as you can see, sort of the biological, the oceanographic components, the biological components, marine environment and habitat, and then fisheries of the California current ecosystem. And you can see we'll be providing notes to the council and the public and the advisory bodies of what we're suggesting for each of these sections. And when we reviewed Chapter 3, we realized some of the information from Chapter 3 could and should go into Chapter 4 and vice versa, and we could consolidate a lot of this information. So, but there's also good information that we just, we don't have elsewhere, like our council fisheries management actions are somewhat summarized on the council's website, but some are just not found elsewhere, so we wanted to keep including that. Whereas things like, you know, we had a long list of international science and management entities that the council participates in Chapter 3, and that could just be moved into a list of the entities in an online appendix with links to all of their websites in case people are interested. So that's Chapter 3. We're recommending, so the bottom line recommendation is to keep it as an informational chapter, but try to slim it down and move the information online where possible and make sure that we're referencing the already good information that's there. So for chapter 4, which is the existing chapter 4, is a look at the concept under the National Environmental Policy Act of cumulative effects, which is an area where we think about ecosystem-based management on a broad scale in federal law. But the council had, with the 2013 Fishery Ecosystem Plan, at the time we were having a lot of lawsuits with NEPA-based challenges, and the council was hoping that the Fishery Ecosystem Plan could serve in some way as a consolidation of ideas about cumulative effects. And the sense of the ecosystem work group was that there are still some good ideas in there, but we wanted to move away from having such a strong NEPA focus, and thinking more about the interacting effects of human activities and environmental shifts on the California current ecosystem. Let's see, am I still scrolling? Yes. So then we looked to the revised FEP goals and objectives, at least as they are currently in draft, in which they should be adopted after this council meeting. And we're thinking that we should frame chapter 4 around the goals and objectives. And this is a question that we'll be asking the council and advisory bodies and the public. Do you think we should be doing that? So, so at any rate, there will be in our current draft outline, we're suggesting a subsection for each of the goals, and then looking at doing an analysis of sort of what are some of the effects of these human activities on different priorities outlined for each of the Fishery Ecosystem Plan's new draft goals. So and those map very nicely to some of the existing sections, most of the existing sections actually of chapter 4, and some of the sections of chapter 3. So we're going to be, and you don't have to try to copy all this down. This will be in our briefing book report. But at any rate, we'll be providing references. Let's see, I'll show you in this section 4.4, for example. So right now, the existing section 3.3.4 discusses human effects on council managed species habitat. And the existing 4.3 discusses direct and indirect effects of fishing on biophysical habitat. And then, you know, it's one of those things, the original Fishery Ecosystem Plan was so large and took us so long to write that, you know, by the time we got to chapter 4, we maybe didn't realize that we had a similar section in chapter 3. So some of this, you know, updating the Fishery Ecosystem Plan is about figuring out where we repeated ourselves in the earlier Fishery Ecosystem Plan. So at any rate, that's what we're doing, just like with this outline, is a very careful look at what do we have in the existing Fishery Ecosystem Plan, how might that change based on what we know now, and what would the outline look like based on those ideas. So we'll have notes for each of those sections. And then chapter 5, we were in an interesting place in terms of public policy making in 2013. You may recall that there was a lot of discussion nationally about a national ocean policy and what we might do for the West Coast. There was the West Coast Governor's Agreement on ocean health, and a lot of folks in the council process were involved in different, you know, management groups for that program. And there was a lot of NEPA work, National Environmental Policy Act work going on with the Navy, expanding their training grounds, and with BOEM on expanding offshore energy production. So at the time, what we wanted the council to have was a chapter 5. It's brief, outlining issues and species and ideas that are of particular interest to the council when other entities are operating in the exclusive economic zone. So if you think of chapter 2, or if you think of chapter 1 now, the goals and objectives is the council's priorities for its work. Chapter 5 is more the council's priorities for the work of others in the exclusive economic zone. So, and the main reason why the council wanted something like this at the time was, I'm sure many of you have been involved in some public process where there's a public comment period, and the only time that the council can comment on an action by another agency is during the public comment period. And maybe that public comment period falls at a time when there's not a council meeting. So, you know, if there were a public comment period that lasted from, say, December 1st of 2019 to February 28th of 2020, there would be no way for the council really to discuss the issue and then have a comment out there. And so this chapter 5 is a way to sort of anticipate some of the broad ideas for what other entities might consider when they're analyzing the effects of their actions on the environment. So we're recommending that the council keep these, keep this chapter and update it, but we're going to ask the council if they think that's reasonable, and then if they want to change some of the priorities that they had articulated in 2013. So that's what's going on with chapter 5. And then chapter 6 is kind of interesting because this is I'm sorry that it's a council process nerd question here. We had in 2013, the council had been reviewing and updating the research and data needs document, which is a document based in the Scientific and Statistical Committee for all the council's perceived science needs. And we ended up with, and that gets updated every 5 years, so 2013, 2018, and next in 2023. And if any of you were involved in the 2018 update, you may recall that it was turned quite large, 230 pages. And there was some discussion in the council process of, well, next time we want this to be, you know, a much more succinct document. And in fact, other fishery management councils who have similar documents, it's a requirement under the Magnuson-Stevens Act to discuss council research and data needs and articulate it in a clear document. But at any rate, other council's documents are, you know, on the order of 6 to 20 pages long. So at any rate, the ecosystem work group would like to have, if possible, some early indicator from the council of whether they want the 2023 version to be much slimmer, in which case we might import some of the ideas from the 2018 document, at least the ecosystem science ideas, into the chapter 6 for the fishery ecosystem plan. I hope that made sense, and I'm going to open it up to questions, but in case it didn't. So those are the remaining chapters of the fishery ecosystem plan, and I'd like to first see if anyone from the ecosystem work group has any questions or comments, and then looking at the time, we can open it up to see if anyone from the public has questions or comments on this stuff. Work group? Okay, it sounds like not, and at least from the work group, although you can chime in at any time. And Kit, I'm sorry, but I'm not good enough at this to figure out if there are any hands raised or folks wanting to comment from the public. So I would just say, if this is okay, with Kit, that if you're not a member of the work group and you have any questions, you should unmute yourself and speak up, please.
Yeah, just a reminder, you should be able to unmute yourself in the webinar controls, so you don't have to get permission from me.
I think what Jessica had pointed out at the beginning was if you hover over your own name in the upper portion of the screen, you should see an unmute control.
It's also at the bottom of the screen too, on the bar. You can unmute yourself there as well.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that you all approve of our plans, and our next step is to sort of tidy this outline up and get it into a report for the council's supplemental briefing book. I hope we can get something to Kit in time to at least get it up on the council's website before the council meets next week. Kit, have we already passed the supplemental briefing book deadline for pre-council work, or when is that?
Yeah, that was pretty much yesterday, I guess. The supplemental public deadline was actually on Friday, but internally, I think it was through yesterday.
Well, just to reiterate, the main focus at this meeting is on those chapters 1 and 2, which, as I had mentioned earlier, let's scroll up to the beginning, are up on the council's website. Okay. Up on the council's website under agenda item, oh goodness, G2. And so the council will be reviewing those, I'm sorry, this is not working now. We'll be reviewing those goals and objectives. Oh, here we go. Okay, thank you. And adopting any revisions. And then for this outline, for the remainder of the fishery ecosystem plan, they're just going to be, providing any suggestions or comments or whatnot. And then if they approve of the general outline, we'll go forth and start, assuming this is what they direct us to do, we'll probably go forth and start writing for them for the September Fishery Management Council meeting.
Yvonne, I have a question for Kit on timing.
Oh, yeah.
So based on that year at a glance, Kit, you had made a comment that the final draft will go out for the other chapters in September. Is that currently on the year at a glance?
Yeah, so the year at a glance basically shows that this update would wrap up in September, whatever that means, but presumably the council has signed off on the remaining changes to the rest of the FEP. So yeah, I just had a question about how to get council guidance, barring some change in that schedule. We would need to be looking at getting guidance at this meeting, which might be difficult since the council probably is not, prepared exactly to consider those, at that level of detail. Well, we can certainly bring that up, or you can bring that up, and obviously if council members do have guidance in that regard, they can provide it, and then see where where you're at and coming out of March.
Thanks for bringing that up, Jessica. It feels a little ambitious to think that we'll do, well, more than a little ambitious to think that we'll do all of this before September. As I mentioned earlier, Chapter 3 is the largest chapter, and if we could get a solid Chapter 3 done, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I was just wondering too, with guidance of what some of these online appendices will actually look like in practice. So providing some of those, like what that time frame would look like, and when next to get feedback from council. If this is the only time, then it seems like that might be difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those, to the degree that they involve, PACFIN data and/or the IEA, any sort of customization of the IEA stuff on their website, there'd be a need to work with them and get that, the staffs of those organizations tasked, if they can be, and it's needed, So that would suggest would take a while.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Corey.
Hello, sorry. This is Corey Niles, for those who don't know my voice. Yeah, on similar, I have a few points. And thanks, Yvonne, for going through that. I think it's a lot to take in for people, even for those of us who've been tuning in more closely. But yeah, I think one thing, the schedule we have to think about for sure. I think the other part we always talk about, and maybe raising again, is kind of what Kit was getting at. And when we wrote this, we had a much bigger team, plans for science center folks on it. So how do we can raise that need again? And I guess just to give, some, at least from my perspective, and I don't think we're all on not on two different pages here. I think our general goal, I kind of say with this revision, is to make progress on making it more of a living document. And I think, I think questions we have are, how do we, and repeating some of what Yvonne said, but how do we make it so it's more of a conversation with the goals and objectives and with the annual report? How does it help people understand what's going on in the annual report better? So I think those are the kind of ideas at least I'm hoping to hear feedback from folks on, is how do we do that? How do we make this more than just something that goes on a shelf that few people read? And I think we've had some good discussion, and hoping we can get the broader council community thinking about that too.
Thanks, Corey. That was a helpful summary. Okay.
Hey, Yvonne?
Else from? Yeah.
This is Chris Harvey. So is it okay for a non-EWG member to make a comment right now?
Oh, please, since you guys are heavily involved in this, whether you want to be or not.
Yeah, for those on the call that don't know who I am, I'm one of the co-editors and presenters of the Ecosystem Status Report, the ESR. And just reflecting on Corey's comment just now, it would be great for, I think anyway, it'd be great for Toby and Garfield and me to participate in that conversation to the extent it's possible, because that way continued evolution of the Ecosystem Status Report is not in a vacuum relative to what y'all are doing with this improvement and update. And if our future development of the Ecosystem Status Report, let's say starting to migrate it more online, for example, so that it was a more continuously updated data repository. So that was done not in a complete vacuum from what the evolution that this is taking and what council needs are, the more coordinated we are on that, obviously, the better.
Thanks, Chris.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry if we started springing this on you guys, but we were thinking about you quite a lot.
Yeah, it's, well, you know, it's consistent, I think, with conversations we're having about how to make our process more, on the one hand, more automated, but also more properly aligned and designed for end users. So although the specifics, of course, aren't spelled out yet, this is, I think, the kind of opportunity we've been anticipating and looking forward to.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any ideas or comments, even if they're just preliminary? We'd love to hear them. Okay, well, with that, it is 11 after 2. I don't know, Kit, would we be violating some, I don't know, Robert's Rule, the border thing, if we were to move to the ecosystem status report? And then Chris and Toby, is it okay with you if we start a little earlier?
It is with me, Toby.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
All
right.
Let's just make sure we hear from Toby first, though, because he starts our presentation. He might be on
Sorry,
mute.
I thought I could just
There we
hit
go.
my phone and unmute, but I had to also click on the screen to unmute. Did Kit say it was okay? Because if it weren't, you could pull up chapter 1 and 2 and just sort of show us a little bit of what's in there.
No, it's fine. As a
Okay.
matter of fact, we have a disclaimer on the agenda that says time served submit. So we don't have to sit around and make up something to fill the time.
Okay. All right. So then, let's see. Unless there's any questions or ideas from the public, then we're going to do our little logistical thing, and I will stop sharing my screen. And then I think either, yeah, okay, great. Sounds like, looks like Chris is sharing here.
Okay, so is it all right if I go?
Go for it.
Yes, please.
Okay, first of all, I just realized that Chris Harvey and I have worked together for too long, because I would have said almost exactly what he said to you a couple of minutes ago. So must be time for us to retire. I would like to thank the EWG for this opportunity to have a pre-brief. I think it'll help our delivery next week to the council, and especially seeing what you just put up, Yvonne. I really hope you all will provide us with questions, especially some of what you said about chapter 2. And one of the things Chris and I did was put some questions that we had for the EWG at the end of our presentation here. So I'm going to read those questions now, and then we'll come back to them at the end. And if people have suggestions, that would be a great discussion. So the questions that Chris and I pose are: who should report to the council on wind energy plans along the West Coast? Is the issue of thiamine deficiency in juvenile salmon on the council's radar? Should we comment? Are there indicators that should be dropped from the report or kept in the report but dropped from the presentation? Others that should be added? And what do you think about the order and structure of the report? For example, what if the human dimension section were presented first? So those are the questions that Chris and I put down to pose to you all at the end of this. I think it's good to give it to you up front so you can think about those or any others. And while Chris—
sorry, Toby.
Yep.
Sorry for interrupting. Will you have those written down on the screen so that we can?
Yes, they are written down on the screen at the end.
Okay.
So we can go through them. We'll go through them again at the end, but I just figured I'd throw them out there now so you could think about as we go through this presentation. And while Chris and I are presenting, I just want to remind you that this work represents a lot of effort by a lot of people. And I'm not going to list them all, but they are recognized in Appendix A of the Ecosystem Status Report. And I believe the report is now on the website, the council website. So you should have access to it. Okay, so Chris, with that, we can go forward. So I got a couple pages of summary. We have a couple pages of summary to start. I will then do the physical oceanography, and Chris will do the ecology section of this. So the large-scale climate indices in 2019 were consistent with low productivity. Along the equator, a weak El Nino existed up until, sorry, question? No, okay. Along the equator, a weak El Nino existed. It transitioned to neutral conditions in June of 2019 and remains pretty much in neutral conditions now. A negative PGO, NPGO, excuse me, which is based on the pressure difference, indicates weak circulation of sub-Antarctic water into the California current. The PDO was neutral to slightly positive. When the PDO is positive, that suggests warmer. So that also indicates lower productivity. And then last summer, we had a large marine heat wave. It actually, an area for a while, was the largest marine heat wave we've seen. It emerged in May, reached a maximum in October, and then pretty much dissipated by December as a surface feature, but not necessarily as a subsurface feature. So if we move to the more regional climate and oceanographic indicators, they were a little more mixed. As I said, the surface and subsurface temperatures are generally above average, both near shore and in the open ocean. The upwelling was average to about above average. The upwelling habitat off Central California was compressed, and this is a new indice that we're introducing this year. It's based on a paper by Jared Santora, talking about the overall average of cool upwelled water and what it means for productivity. And then the snowpack in 2019 was below average in the north. It was generally above average elsewhere, and that was reflected in some of the stream flow. So many of the ecological indicators were average or above average. We had the northern assemblage of liquid-rich copepods predominated off of Newport. There's a high abundance of anchovy off the California coast. The average densities of juvenile salmon, we had average densities of juvenile salmon off of Oregon and Washington, and above average abundance and growth of the California sea lions. There are signs of concern in the ecological indicators as well. There were poor catches of krill. Krill seemed to be very low in 2019. In the south, we still were seeing high densities of Pyro Zones, which are warm water tunicates and disrupt the whole ecosystem. There was very poor production of several of the bird species off both Central and Northern California, indicating poor prey. And there was a poor outlook for salmon returns into the Central Valley. Finally, the last summary slide here, the fisheries landings seem to have dipped slightly in 2018. Hake accounted for 63% of the landed weight, and 2019 landings should be available next week. I'm actually not sure if they are going to be available next week. The expectations for this summer, the models are suggesting that ENSO neutral conditions will continue through the summer of 2020. The ocean surface and subsurface temperatures remain high. Hypoxia off Washington and Oregon is forecast to arrive earlier and be more severe this summer. That's with the J-scope model. Presently, the snow water equivalent is below 50% in California, mixed in Oregon and Washington and Idaho. So it's almost a reverse of last year. And the salmon size outlook average in the Columbia River and Oregon coast, but below average in the Central Valley. So in the past, we've used these two type of diagrams for reporting data. The time series data on the left there, which shows the over the period that we have data, the mean and standard deviation of whatever indice we're looking at, as well as the green is generally the last 5 years, sometimes shorter, showing the trends and average values in the last 5 years. And those trends and average in the last 5 years can be moved over to a quad plot like the orange arrow there, showing you that we're able to take the time series data, that last 5-year summary of trend and average, and put it on a plot where we can put multiple species on that plot. So the x-axis is the recent trend, whether positive, negative, and the y-axis is the recent average above or below. And the dashed lines are generally the standard deviation or the confidence levels in those. Yeah, okay. So moving on to the physical oceanography conditions. I would summarize it as warm ocean, weak circulation, and a short but very significant marine heat wave occurred in the summer of 2019. So the Ocean Nino Index, which is probably one of the most important indices for looking at overall conditions in the Northeast Pacific. Generally, we had a strong El Nino in 2015. That then it's been quite variable since then. We had a weak El Nino in the fall of 2018, winter of 19. But we're now in ONI neutral conditions. And as I said, there's a 50% chance that those Nino neutral conditions will continue through the summer. The North Pacific gyre oscillation, which is an indication of the strength of the circulation of the subantarctic water, a positive NPGO is stronger circulation, generally higher productivity in the California current ecosystem, whereas a negative NPGO, weaker circulation, which results in lower productivity. And you can see over the last 5 years, it has been neutral or negative, and actually right now it's about as low as it's ever been. So it's strongly negative, and the suggestion is that circulation will be low again this spring, this summer. The Pacific Decadal oscillation, which is more related to the temperature patterns. So a positive PDO is generally warmer, and again, warmer, lower productivity, negative PDO, cool, greater productivity. And you can see that at the beginning of this last 5-year period, it was positive for low productivity. That was during the marine heat wave of 2015, and then the large El Nino. Reduced down to neutral conditions, went negative last year, and is now slightly rising, but it remains in a neutral position and was in a neutral position for most of 2019. So sea surface temperatures in the Northeast Pacific, both on the left are the winter conditions, on the right are the summertime summary. You can see that it was extremely warm both in the winter and in the summer. The X's, if you can see the X's on all those two plots, those are the highest recorded values that we've seen. So especially in the summer, during that extremely large, brief, but intense marine heat wave of 2019, we saw some record temperatures in the Northeast Pacific. The lower plots are showing both the 5-year mean and the 5-year trend. And in the wintertime, you can see that the 5-year mean has been quite warm along the whole continental margin, a little cooler out towards the Central Pacific. And the 5-year trend in the wintertime is negative, and that's primarily because 2015 was so warm that even though the following years have still been warm, it's been a slight decrease in trend. But I want to emphasize it is still warm out there. Similarly, the 5-year mean for the summertime shows you that it's most of the whole area there was very high and almost record. Even for the mean, it's almost a record. Again, the 5-year trend is sort of mixed with warming in the north and south and cooling in the central area, which is somewhat similar to the general PDO trend. So just to give you an idea of the marine heat wave we had last summer, it's also compared here to the blob event of 2014-15. And what I'm showing you here is an indice that Andy Lysing has developed where the criteria to outline a blob is to say that a standardized standard deviation, well, it's above 1.86 standard deviation, the delta T. So it has to be quite warm. The area has to be greater than about 100,000 kilometers squared, and the duration has to be longer than 5 days. And so these two events are the two largest events that we've seen in the satellite record that goes back to 1982. What you can see last summer was that in early May, or the middle of May, there wasn't much of an expression there, but by July, it had covered a very large area, and September it reached its maximum area in October and then started dissipating, and you see this January 15th of 2020. There is very little surface expression. What we don't know is just how much heat is at depth. And so depending on both the atmospheric system, if we get another blocking system this summer, and how much heat is down below, it may or may not return this summer. So we're going to be watching this aspect of it very closely going forward. So moving now to, oh, and yes, here's an example. Sorry, got to go back on my own slides here. Nope. Where are you? Yeah, thanks. Where are you going, Chris? I'm done with that one. Thank you. So looking at the subsurface temperatures, these are two stations along the coast. One is the Newport, the top one is the Newport Hydrographic Station. This is NH25, which is their station that is 25 kilometers offshore. And the other one is the Cal Coffee Station 93.3, which is down off of San Diego. And you can see that, especially up north, you can see both the surface heating from last summer's marine heat wave, but you'll also see that the subsurface temperatures are still quite warm, showing about an anomaly of about 1 degree at depth. And down south, it looks like you are seeing, first of all, a little bit of the El Nino that was in the early part of the year, and then you see at the end of it the marine heat wave. It's still warm at depth, although it shows a little bit of cooling there. So the conditions are a little bit different between Newport and San Diego. In San Diego, most of the heating from the marine heat wave was in the surface. And one of the things we didn't see last summer was, if you recall, in the 2015 marine heat wave, the blob, there was a very large expression of it off of Baja California, and we didn't see that this past summer. So the surface impact seems to be a little bit different in the Southern California bight than off the northern part of the coast. Okay, local conditions then, the upwelling. If you recall, we have gone from using the Bakken Upwelling Index to an index that's based on upwelling from a climate model, a ROMS model. And so we now have two indices of upwelling. One is the transport, or the Coastal Upwelling Transport Index, which is on the left. And then also we can do an estimate of the nutrient supply, the nitrate supply, that is brought into the euphotic zone by upwelling. So that's on the right-hand side. So left side is a measure of the flux of water to the surface. The right-hand side is the flux of nutrients into the euphotic zone. And one of the things you see on the upper left there, that insert, those 3 stars are the location of these 3 time series for the last year that are being shown here. And looking at that upper left, you can see the red is indicative of the higher upwelling, and that really goes the region from Cape Blanco down to a little bit south of, well, towards Point Conception. We see that we have much higher upwelling than we do up to the north or to the south, and that's reflected in the upwelling values that you see on the left-hand side. those are all on the same scale, so you can see that the Point Arena upwelling is quite a bit stronger, a lot more variable than what you see off of either Newport or San Diego. The upwelling values were about average or slightly above average, but as I said, there's a lot of variability over that upwelling. And an aside here is one of the things we're starting to look at is the importance of that variability, because we know that if you have just plain upwelling, it can be so strong that it just blows the water and the accompanying wildlife offshore, and it's not available for the system. So you really want to have both strong upwelling and relaxation occurring, and you see that off the Point Arena. On the nitrate side, you can also see that the nutrient supply in Central California is about an order of magnitude greater than either Newport or San Diego. And one thing I should point out is that where the values of the nutrient supply are negative, that really doesn't mean anything in terms of what's going on out there. So we probably should cut it off at 0, but anyways, that's okay. One thing that has been, it was a new indice that was produced over this last year, and partly as a result of the whale entanglement increase, is looking at what we're calling the Coastal Habitat Compression Index. So this is based on the same model that's being used for the upwelling, but at this time they're limiting it to 35 to 40 degrees north, or about Point Sur to Cape Mendocino. So they're really looking at that area. What they're doing is looking at the actual area of water that's less than 12 degrees. So this is the surface water that is less than 12 degrees, and you map out the area of it. And you also look at the delta temperature, the temperature difference between the onshore and offshore areas, to come up with this index. And it's got, so a low index means that you have very little cold water, so that what you're going to be doing is compressing most of your habitat into a very narrow area. A large area would mean you got really strong upwelling that's extending offshore. And so, you know, when the habitat is compressed along the coast, most of your ecological indicators are also going to be compressed into there and can be intensified. So starting with the, blob in 2014, the habitat index decline. So we had greater habitat compression, and it's remained average or below average since then. Now, historically, it's been minimum before, so that's not something that's new, but it does give us an indication of whether we think we're going to see some of this ecological interaction being intensified. In terms of the whale entanglement, I'm not quite ready. In terms of the whale entanglement, it was a combination of this compression plus the HABs plus the delay in the fisheries opening. So it was a lot of factors that came into play with the whale entanglement. This compression is one of them. And it seems as though this habitat compression, it doesn't vary directly with upwelling. It seems to be related more with the ONI and the PDO variation. So it maybe is a way of looking at the combined effect of the ONI and the PDO on coastal processes. Okay. So dissolved oxygen values, remembering the hypoxic threshold is below 1.4 milliliters of oxygen per liter. The dissolved oxygen values in Newport were among the lowest observed. If you look in the time series there, you can see they went below the hypoxic level. And if you look at the mapping of benthic dissolved oxygen, you can see that starting in August, there was extensive hypoxia on the shelf in late summer. So the yellow, orange, red on the map there would be hypoxic conditions. If you look in the Southern California Bight, the time series there is the dissolved oxygen at 150 meters, and you can see that generally it was not hypoxic down in the Southern California Bight offshore. The plan view on the bottom there is showing At Calcoffee, the CTD will go to 500 meters or the bottom. And so most of this diagram is showing you the values at 500 meters, which are pretty much hypoxic. And then you get up into the Channel Islands area, and you can see in the benthic areas, it was not hypoxic in the shallower areas of the Channel Islands area there. So moving on to ocean acidification and the aragonite, you can see that the summer-fall of 2019 was well below the aragonite dissolution value of 1 near the seafloor at both stations. So 50 meters at NH5, that's the station that's 5 kilometers offshore, and the aragonite at 150 meters at NH25 was completely, the whole time it was below 1, so it would be dissolving, it would be corrosive conditions for aragonite. And if you look at the time series of aragonite at NH25, you can see that actually last year, the solid line would be the corrosive index. Below that, the blue colors are corrosive, the red and yellows are not corrosive. So you can see that last year, actually, it did not come up as much on the shelf as the previous 3 years, but it was still within that range. So about 60–80% of the water column was corrosive. The J-scope model, which is being used to predict conditions off the Oregon and Washington coast, what you can see from here for benthic dissolved oxygen, the forecast for this summer is that there will be widespread hypoxia starting in June. You can see the purple value there starting in June pretty much is going to take over the whole coast. And not shown, but also the average temperatures along this area should be warmer than average by July or August is the prediction. If we also, there's a lot of uncertainty in these, okay? If we also look at the benthic aragonite saturation, you can see that it'll become undersaturated, corrosive throughout the region by late spring, March, April, in that area too. And again, I will go back to that. There is a fair bit of uncertainty in this model, but it's the best we got at the moment. So what do I have left? Oh, what I have left, the snowpack. So the snow water equivalent in 2019, it was below average in the north. That's anything that's below average would be orange and reds. You can see a lot of it in the north was below average, whereas in the Central Valley, Sacramento, San Joaquin River system, it was well above average, in some places over 200%. So drought conditions up in the north, a lot of snowpack in the south in 2019. And that was generally reflective of the stream patterns of that year. This year is very different. It's almost the complete swap. The month of January has been a complete drought in California. And so beginning of January, the snowpack was looking pretty good. Now it's less than 50% for most of California, whereas up in Oregon, Washington, and inland, it's sort of average to above average. So the conditions are better up north, pretty dire down south. The National Weather Outlook is for drought for February to April to continue in much of Oregon and in Northern California. So it's looking like we could have a poor snowpack year. And the official measurement is April 1st, so that's when we can. That's when they will report the final version of the snow accumulation. And finally, I have one more slide, I believe. Streamflow for the salmon ESUs. What it looks like is the flows have been increasing over the one-day maximum flow has been increasing. That's partly because of the drought conditions in 2015, except for the west of the Cascades. That area is showing maybe reduced. The trend is reduced one-day maximum flows. Probably most of that's within the standard deviation margin of error. And the 7-day minimum flow also is showing an indication. The recent average is lower, but the indication is that it's increasing. So it's still low, but it's better than it was in 2015. And you're seeing that slow improvement there. And I think, Chris, I think it's all yours now.
Okay, thanks. So we'll start with the ecological responses, first with some of the signs that we consider to be average or above average in terms of productivity of species that are of importance to the council and to conservation interests. And for the most part, these average or above average responses seem to have been located in the northern or more southern parts of the system. And to start, we always like to begin with the copepod time series off of Newport, Oregon, which has been collected regularly since the late 1990s at roughly 2 to 4 week intervals. And we think of the northern copepods, which we often describe as the cheeseburger copepods, as the ones that are very rich in lipids, larger bodied, and store more energy because they have to overwinter in colder waters. And these were above average in the spring and summer of 2019 and have been showing an overall increase in abundance over the last 5 years since the very low biomasses that occurred during the warm blob. And this is encouraging as a source of food for lower trophic levels, including some of the fish that are preyed upon by things like young salmon. In contrast, the southern copepods, which here we depict as the celery copepods and are lower in lipids, lower in wax esters and other nutritional things for fish, have been declining gradually over the last 5 years, and their counts in 2019 were roughly average. There's variability in there, but they were roughly average. So this means that the ratio of copepods was fairly favorable to energy-rich and productive conditions for fish consumption, and we would call that good news. Although it does seem like the productivity of the northern copepods, as you can see, was highest here in the late spring, early summer. The overall season where they were abundant was truncated somewhat in early summer. The forage community, we have gone through lots of permutations of how we present the forage community over the years. And last year we debuted this way of looking at forage, where this is basically a heat map, and we're going to focus for now on the central region of the California Current, where that green box is in the map. So just off of Monterey Bay and San Francisco Bay, each one of these color cells represents a particular species during a particular year. The vertical lines lump the data into years that were similar to one another, and then the horizontal lines lump groups of fish and as ones that co-occur with each other. So this breaks the forage community into different regimes. And you can see that based on that heavy line, that heavy vertical line from 2018 forward, that for the last couple of years, we've had a fairly consistent forage community off of this part of the coast that's defined almost entirely by extremely abundant adult anchovy. There's also been a slight uptick in sardines, which is encouraging, although we should point out that this is mainly relative to what's been present over the past decade. It's still not quite as abundant as they've been more historically back into the 90s. Another defining group in this assemblage is market squid, which have been relatively abundant over the last couple of years. And then another defining quality of this forage assemblage that's currently off of Central California is how low it is in juvenile rockfish, flatfish, and hake. They've declined quite steeply compared to the very abundant state that they were in during the warm blob in the subsequent couple of years. So again, the real take home here is that the forage community right now off of Central California is very much defined by abundant anchovy. And that's consistent also with what we're seeing off of Southern California for the region that's there more in orange. And it's also consistent with some data that are somewhat hot off the press here from our colleagues at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center who do the assessment of CPS along the coast. This is the first time we've actually been able to include these in our reporting, although they weren't in the briefing book. This was just published by Stierhoff and colleagues as a tech memo. You can see that in the bar plot that CPS biomass has been increasing pretty sharply over the last couple of years relative to the anomalously warm years of 2014 through 17. A lot of that biomass increase has been driven by anchovy in both years, and then most recently in 2019, we also saw increases in jack mackerel. And as you can see on the map, most of that jack mackerel biomass is north of Cape Mendocino, and then also increases in herring, which you can see on the map is mostly north of Newport and extending up into Canada. Whereas those green circles indicate the extremely large biomass and community dominance of anchovy in the central and southern portion of the California current ecosystem. Moving on to other signals of average to above average conditions, juvenile salmon catches in regular surveys that occur in the northern portion of the California current off of the Oregon and Washington coasts in 2019 saw catches of juvenile Chinook and coho salmon that were about as close to average over the long term of this survey as possible. I mean, they were all three just about right on the average line. And this indicates a continue of a rebound from the very, very low catches that occurred just a couple years ago in 2017. So this indicates that conditions for salmon off this portion of the coast were around average for growth and survival. And then a lot of the data that Toby showed, as well as these copepod indicators, some of the forage indicators, and the salmon catch indicators populate this stoplight table that we've been showing for the last several years that can be used as a general indication of the strength of salmon returns that we can expect to see along the Oregon coast for coho salmon, and up into the Columbia River for Chinook salmon in 2020. So this coming year. The central columns in this table with the smolt years 2016 through 2019 indicate conditions of both physical and biological indicators during the years that different smolt groups went to sea. And those are the groups of smolts that went to sea that we should start to see coming back as dominant age classes this coming year. So for coho, the dominant age class would be smolts that went to sea in 2019, and you can see a lot of those indicators indicated by the red diamonds mean that they were in the lower third of all of the time series in terms of just their raw rank. And then a lot of them were also in the yellow squares, which indicates that they were in the middle third. So overall, these do not look like the best conditions for coho and would lead us to conclude there's a reasonable chance that coho returns to the Oregon coast will be below average. For Chinook that are returning to Bonneville Dam, and beyond, most of the indicators would be for smolt year 2018, which represents the bulk of the fish that will be Chinook that will be returning in 2020, and the majority of those indicators are in the middle third of the historic rankings, and therefore this is consistent with fairly average returns of Chinook to Bonneville Dam. And the more numeric version of this, this outlook forecast, which we included in the appendix of our briefing book report, again, is consistent with these expectations of average returns of Chinook in 2020 to this region slightly similar to or slightly above what we saw last year. Another encouraging sign is in terms of system productivity is sea lion pups off of or on the San Miguel Island colony. The pup counts from the 2018 cohort were among the higher ones that we've seen and were significantly above average. Then also the growth rate of that cohort was above average, and both of those indexes have been increasing over the last 5 years. And pup count and pup growth are indicative of good feeding conditions for both the gestating mothers from fall of 17 to summer of 18, and then again for nursing mothers from summer of 18 to early winter of 19. In that rectangle that's indicated on the map at the upper left corner. So this indicates that there was good feeding conditions for those mothers to support their pups, and the scat analysis from the 2018 cohort indicates that those adult female sea lions were feeding very heavily on anchovy, as you'd expect from the forage plots shown earlier, as well as a mix of mackerels, squid, Pacific hake, and some sardine. So this represents a diverse diet of high quality prey. And then the preliminary information that we have on the 2019 cohort, these were pups that were born last June, again suggest an above average pup count, slightly lower than the 18, but still above average, and some of the highest growth rates that, that our colleagues doing this work have ever observed for these pups between June and this February. And based on the scat analysis, it looks like the females that are supporting these pups are feeding almost exclusively on anchovy. So very productive conditions for these sea lion pups based on the feeding food availability in the central and southern portions of the system. Finally, we often include the groundfish assessment outputs, especially in a year like this where we've just come off of a series of updates to many of the species assessments. So this plot of the stock status of groundfish on the x-axis and whether they're being subjected to high fishing pressure on the y-axis indicates that groundfish management right now is doing well, in that there are no species right now that are to the left of those red vertical lines, and that means no fish are currently in an overfished status. Cow cod have been rebuilt as of the last assessment. The yellow eye are not fully rebuilt yet, but they are not in that that status of being to the left of their limit reference point. So this suggests that those stocks are rebuilding or already fully rebuilt. And then there are only a couple of species, rough eye and green striped rockfish, that are peaking just up above the overfishing proxy. As of our last update, a couple of stocks of black rockfish and of China rockfish were above that overfishing proxy, but they've now dipped below based on the most recent update. So for the most part, groundfish coast-wide look like they are in good shape relative to these limit points. So that's the good news. There was some signs of concern from 2019, and almost all of that was concentrated in Central and Northern California for reasons that I'm not sure we can really draw sharp conclusions on right now. The first sign of concern is krill biomass and krill size. As you can see from the plot on the top, this is in the star that's located right there in Central California, just off of Monterey Bay. Krill catch per unit effort in 2019 was just about the lowest that they have seen in this regular survey that dates back actually into the 80s. Coupled with that, you can see in the krill size estimates that were collected off of Trinidad Head, that's the more northerly of the two stars in that map. Krill lengths were below average in 2019. After several years of pretty steady improvement post warm blob, they dipped back down in terms of their length. So we have fewer krill, and the ones that were out there appeared to be smaller. And we can expand these two time series that are concentrated at those 2 points to some maps that look more off of Oregon from a similar kind of survey that's done off of Oregon that's been done since 2011. These are heat maps that show the catch per unit effort of krill since 2011. And prior to the onset of the warm blob in later 2014, it's clear that krill abundance, as depicted by those warmer colors, was quite high, ranging from 41 to 175. I believe these are individuals per toe. Whereas more recently, and as recently as 2019, we're down to mostly, well, orders of magnitude lower than that, less than 1 individual per toe in 2019. So this is a sharp drop off in krill catch per unit effort. There's some evidence from acoustic surveys and other plankton hauls that go into deeper water than this particular survey that there were krill present. It's just that they're much deeper than normal, and that makes them less accessible to some predators. So there's still some question about exactly how to interpret this, but it is clear that krill were less available to more surface-oriented predators in 2019, and that continues a trend, at least in these waters, that's been going on for a while. Another sign of concern off of Central California is the struggles that we saw in several of the seabird colonies. And these are seabirds that feed on a wide range of different prey. Cassin's auklets, located in the center left column here, prey almost exclusively on krill, whereas the other ones are more a mix of different kinds of prey, fish, squid, and krill, and what's available to them at the depths to which they dive. Brandt's cormorants in 2019, you can see in the upper left of these time series, were fairly stable. These are for fledgling success rates on the southeast Farallon Island colony. Brandt's cormorants did okay in 2019, but Cassin's auklets, common murres, rhinoceros auklets, and pigeon guillemots, you can all see really plunged in terms of their ability to produce viable young by the end of the breeding season. And this was despite the great abundance of anchovies in this area. And the mechanisms here aren't entirely clear. What does seem clear, at least for some of these birds, was that the anchovies were mainly adult anchovy, and they were too large for the chicks to actually feed on them. When the adults brought them back, they were simply too big for the chicks to ingest. So the rising tide of anchovies, at least in this region, doesn't seem to raise all boats. Not all of these predators are able to benefit from that. And then Cassin's auklets, again, because krill appear to be so rare, Cassin's auklets really took it on the chin as well. And another sign of concern with the seabirds is common murres had a wreck, which a wreck is when our colleagues that do beach walks observe large numbers of individuals that are washed up dead on beaches. What's odd about this particular wreck is it occurred during the breeding season rather than after the breeding season. We often see wrecks after the breeding season, after the adults have expended a lot of energy feeding and provisioning their chicks. This happened in the middle of the breeding season, and these were adult birds that were washing up in a emaciated state in Northern California. So it's not entirely clear why those common murres in Northern California struggled the way they did at a time when we wouldn't normally expect it. But there apparently was a lack of availability of prey to them in that portion of the year. Our friends, the Pyro Zones, that have been such a plague to a lot of parts of the coast over the last several years, are once again in the news, although the news here is that while they remain abundant, that abundance has shifted very, very strongly. They were quite abundant off of Washington and Oregon, as well as California, through much of the last 3 years. But then in 2019, they were almost unobserved off of Washington and a good portion of Oregon. It's not till we get south of Cape Mendocino that we start to see those abundances that we really grew to expect during the peak of the marine heat wave that began, the blob that began in 2014. The greatest densities that were observed were between San Francisco Bay and Point Conception. So pyro zones remain present. They remain a potential problem for competing with other things that feed on plankton and for fouling fishing gear, but most of that problem seemed to shift south of Cape Mendocino last year. At the request of many groups in the council, we have tried to expand our ability to provide stoplight style information for salmon returns to other portions of the coast. So this year, for the first time, we're presenting this table. It's similar to the stoplight table we showed earlier for Columbia River and Oregon Coast salmon. This is focused on Central Valley fall Chinook and is derived from a paper that was published last year by Friedman and colleagues that connects the returns of salmon, fall Chinook salmon to the Sacramento and San Joaquin. They looked at a series of different indicators that were related to the salmon life cycle that's depicted up there in the upper right. And they settled on these 4 indicators: the parent spawning escapement size, incubation temperature of the eggs, median flow the year following their spawning, and then finally the predation index of the abundance of marine seabirds during the first year that the salmon go to sea. And for the dominant age class that's going to be returning to the Central Valley in 2020, which were fish that were spawned in 2017, we see very grim news based on the indicators, at least. This was one of the lowest spawning escapement populations that are in the time series. Incubation temperature was warmer than is ideal. Flow was much lower than is ideal, and there was fairly average seabird predation for that particular year, anticipated for that year, which sums up to expectation of low returns of fall Chinook to the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. Whale entanglements remain a problem, although the numbers were down relative to the previous 4 years of 2015 through 18. There were still above average whale entanglements in fixed fishing gear relative to years prior to the onset of the warm blob. The decrease may reflect some of the precautionary management actions that were taken in the crab fishery. Confirmed reports were distributed across all 3 of the coastal states, and again, most of the entanglements were humpbacks, and still most of the gear is unidentified, but what is identified tends to be crab gear as well as some gillnet gear. And finally, there continue to be some harmful algal bloom issues with high levels of domoic acid in razor clams and Dungeness crab. You can see in the outlined red blocks from the Oregon coast and Northern California that we continue to see both razor clams and Dungeness crabs well above the advisory levels for a domoic acid derived from harmful algal blooms of the diatom Pseudonychia. In 2020, most of the Oregon coast harmful algal bloom problems were concentrated in the southern portion of the state. So this is down more like in the Brookings area, and you can see that they stayed above those advisory levels and led to widespread closures of razor clams, Dungeness crabs, and even rock crab in Northern California for much of 2019. The Washington coast did not experience these elevated levels of domoic acid in razor clams or Dungeness crab, and it's not shown, but there were no closures for spiny lobster or rock crabs in Southern California. So most of the action here seemed to be concentrated in Northern California and the Southern Oregon coast. We'll shift gears now to human activities and human well-being. We just have a few indicators here that we've been tracking. We have landings data through 2018. We do hope to have the 2019 landings updated. We just have a couple of calculations need to be run on those. But at least through 2018, we can say that total landings ticked slightly down from 2017. The total landed biomass was down by about 8%, and revenue was down just by about 7% relative to 2017. So not much changed as a whole. Although it is worth noting that of that landed weight, roughly 2/3 of it was Pacific hake in 2018, and this is fairly consistent for what's been going on for the last several years, where hake really are carrying a lot of the load. In contrast, coastal pelagic finfish, salmon, groundfish, and HMS all are near the time series lows for the data that are presented here. So again, a lot of the fishery landings here are represented by just a small number of abundant species that are landed. We've continued to see the diversification of revenues that are landed by West Coast vessels to be low. It didn't really change very much from 2018 to relative to 2017, and that's true regardless of the classifications of vessels that you look at for the most part. So if you view them by size, by which state they are flagged from, or what their revenue class was, for the most part, diversification of revenue is low. And there's concern that low diversification means that a vessel or vessel class or port group or what have you is not as resilient to changes in availability or regulation of fish as a more diversified group would be. In response to a request by the Ecosystem Advisory subpanel a couple of years ago, we have tried to introduce a new indicator that would relate to success toward addressing National Standard 8 of maintaining economic viability and opportunity for different coastal communities. And I would think of this as a trial balloon. What we've calculated here is the proportion of total revenue of all commercial fishing that is being brought into different ports. And these represent 16 ports that most often show up as among the top revenue earners or revenue recipients of commercial fishing revenue over the past roughly 40 years. So we could do this for any community, but just to keep it simple, as we're floating this trial balloon, we just focused on these top 16 ports. And what we're looking for here are long-term trends to see if it's possible to conclude that revenue is either being consolidated in some ports where you start to see increasing trends, or maybe revenue is leaving ports that see consistent decreasing trends. And we can break this out, as we did in the briefing book, our supplement, by different FMPs as well. But we're not trying to go too far overboard yet, because this is a new index and we're looking for some feedback, and we do plan to drill into this more over the next several months. In short here, you can see long-term increases in the total proportion of the proportion of total revenue that came into Westport and Newport. You can see long-term decreases in the proportion of total revenue landed in Bellingham, Crescent City, Fort Bragg, St. Pedro, and Terminal Island. And then the other communities are fairly stable or show variability rather than a consistent long-term trend. And of particular interest, I think, are communities like Westport, where you see this long-term increase, and also Crescent City and Fort Bragg, where you can see long-term decreases, because these are communities that also show up as having relatively high coastal community vulnerability in terms of their ability to withstand just general shocks to their social or economic system, because they might happen to have, say, relatively low total household income, or relatively high rates of risky behaviors, or single-parent families, or challenges with education and total household ownership and things like that. So these are communities that in particular we would want to watch to see how they are being affected by changes in revenue, whether that's long-term or in terms of variability. Again, we're really looking for feedback on this, and we plan to develop this further. Finally, we've been presenting maps of seafloor contact by federally regulated bottom trawl gear for the last several years. And following review by the SSC last year, we've revised this slightly. What you can see in this plot, or in these maps, is both the total distance that was trawled in different cells that are 2 by 2 kilometer grids in 2018 at the left of each one of these panels. Then in the center is how much above or below average for a particular area 2018 was. So an above average area shows up as red, a below average area shows up as blue for 2018, which is the most recent year data available. And then we see if there's a trend over the last 5 years. And you can see that there are some particular hotspots represented by the red cells. Both the 2018 anomalies and the trends, the hotspots tend to appear in the same area, so off of central Washington, central and northern Oregon, and then just north of Cape Mendocino. We will continue to follow these patterns both as spatial regulations for the trawl fishery change over the next few years, as well as in relation to discussions around wind power that might co-locate with some of these fishing areas. So to conclude the information that Toby and I have presented, throughout most of 2019, water temperatures were warmer than normal, both at the surface and at depth for most of the California current ecosystem, as well as the North Pacific. And perhaps that was most exemplified by a new marine heat wave, similar in magnitude in size and intensity to the blob that occurred in the summer and then dissipated by the end of the fall. It's too early for us to determine if there were, or to attribute any of the ecological responses that we've talked about to it, but we're certainly going to be watching our ecological indicators to see if there's anything that really pegs to that event. And we're also going to be following water temperatures at the surface and subsurface very carefully in 2020 to see if the system is right now just basically preconditioned to be susceptible to rapid warming, and if we see another heat wave emerge. Despite these relatively warm waters, we've got very abundant anchovy as well as some other abundant forage stocks throughout the system. That abundant forage base is benefiting some, but not all predators. The ecological indicators were largely average or above average in much of the north and the south, but there were a lot of those problems that I talked about of average or below average signals in the central portion of the system. And then, as Toby indicated at the beginning, we have some questions that we're certainly looking to you for. This was our first chance to present this report this year, and I acknowledge that we've gone on rather long. We hope you don't mind being our test kitchen for this, but we're certainly interested to know your thoughts on these questions. And you've been just such terrific partners to us over the years, and we're happy to extend that partnership and look for feedback on these questions or any other thoughts that you might have jotted down during our presentation. And with that, we will conclude and take any questions you have.
Okay, well, I guess in the absence of any silence, this is Kit. I just thank you for a great report and comprehensive overview.
Excuse me, Kit.
Yeah.
This is Scott. I had a question for Chris. Has there been any effort to get additional water temperature at depth locations besides the NH5 and NH25 lines?
That's definitely a better question for Toby. Let me zip back up to that that slide. We do have cow coffee data in there too, but Toby can definitely take this one.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we are very lucky in that there is starting to be a pretty established array of gliders along the whole West Coast. So we have gliders. Oh, go back to that one you were just at for a second. Oh, well. There, the gliders in Southern California actually are on each side of the box on the lower right. So one's on line 93.3 and the other one's on line 80. Then we have a glider line coming out of Monterey Bay. We're just establishing a glider line up off Bodega. And then there's the Newport and Trinidad headlines. Whether the northern line out of Astoria there, that area, we don't know if that glider line will be reestablished. But those gliders go to 1,000 meters. So we're starting to build a time series from these gliders of subsurface temperature. In addition to that, we've also started looking at some of the Argo data to get the farther offshore estimates. So we're coming up with a number of ways to look at offshore temperature. And actually, in the appendix of the written report, I included some temperature data from the Southern California glider lines, just to give you an idea of what we can do. And I'm just trying to find which appendix that is in as I'm talking here. It is in appendix D2, shows
Sorry about that.
some of the temperature data from the two Southern California lines. So we will be, I would put those in the appendix this year since it's the first year we've used them, and we will be moving them into the main body of the report in the future.
Okay, great. It seems like, if I remember right, in the past we've seen much more data from the south and not a lot from north. I think above Newport, I don't even know if we had anything. Or is there glider data from north of Newport now?
There was for a while. I know that glider got hit, and I don't know if they were able to replace it.
Not yet.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, somebody said not yet.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, this is Yvonne, I wanted to thank you guys for providing us all this information, and also for trying out the presentation on us. And I wanted to particularly call out a couple of indicators and pieces of information that you provided in response to some of the past requests from us and others. Thank you very much for thinking about the questions of the fishing revenue by port. I know that also the granolic acid information has been asked for by a variety of different people up and down the coast. And the Central Valley Chinook information is great, even if it's not happy news. It's nice to have some more information on there. And then also pleased to see the CPS biomass indicator in there. And so thank you for folks who may not be aware, these annual ecosystem status reports are part of an ongoing conversation between the centers and the council, and it's great to see a bunch of these different changes. And I particularly, if you wouldn't mind going to slide 14, wanted to sort of highlight and thank you for thinking about this coastal habitat compression idea. This really resonated with me, although I may not understand the graph here. I just wanted to see at the upper, so when we're in the upper areas of the graph, that means that we have a larger habitat area, so therefore less habitat compression. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, you are.
Okay, all right. Well, I just wanted to reflect on to me, why I like this, it was just very easy for me to visualize and not a scientist. So it's great when I can have something in my brain about, you know, sort of picturing what the habitat area is. But I also think it's wonderful for some of the projects that the council is working on in the near future, like coastal pelagic species and highly migratory species, essential fish habitat, sort of thinking about habitat not just as a, you know, fixed space where we often tend to think of it for groundfish, you know, what kind of bottom habitat do we have, but also sort of the temperature and salinity and other indicators of, you know, where different species like to hang out. But I also, the nerd part of me really likes this idea for thinking about near-term climate variability and long-term climate change. And I'm super curious whether there are scientists in other parts of the world who are looking on eastern boundary currents have thought about habitat compression, and if, you know, if Jared and others have maybe compared notes between ecosystems. I mean, I realize that's a bigger question than the Pacific Council, but boy, this is super interesting to me. So thank you for including that.
Well, I will send you, I'll send you a copy of Jared's paper that came out 2 weeks ago, I think. And I'm scanning the reference list to see if I see it. I mean, I'm sure there are other areas where it's been looked at, but I don't see anything just jumping out at me. But there are 74 references here, so.
Well, it's just, you know, the nature of an eastern boundary current and its sort of narrow continental shelf and narrow habitat area with high productivity, it's just very interesting and to me, and sort of it seems like it would be interesting to compare.
Yeah, I think one of the keys of being able to do this particular study is going to a model for determining upwelling and extent, as opposed to, we just probably would never have enough measurements to really do a similar type analysis as well. So the fact that the modeling community is working so hard on this is really important.
Thank you. Well, so
Corey,
and then the other thing is just, go ahead, Corey.
Right. No, after you follow, if you got to follow up. Excuse me.
Oh, I just wanted to make an organizational summary statement here, which was just that for the ecosystem work group, we are not going to be receiving this report again from the centers. We may have some time with Chris and Toby at the March Council meeting to ask some questions, but from here out, our job is to ask questions here today and then to read all of the report and its appendices if you haven't already done so, and then maybe follow up with questions later. So with that, go ahead, Corey.
Thanks, and thanks, Chris and Toby. Awesome presentation again. And yeah, Yvonne answered one of my questions, and whether you all would be available for talking to us, if not giving a presentation, some, you know, on this presentation, but on the other FEP topic as well. If you had time, come in and talk to the work group. That would be, I think, constructive time spent. And I don't know if I want to ask all my questions now, or some of them are pretty small potatoes, and really are more just better understanding how things work. But you know, since Toby had the mic there for a bit, one of my questions, Toby, about when you're using the model, I think, and I'm going to get this slightly wrong, and Tom, you might help me here, but off of northern Washington, Vancouver Island, as I understand it, the oceanography is, you know, it's not so wind-based upwelling. A lot of exchange between the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the ocean, the water. That kind of difference in our region captured in these indices that you're now using, because they're, you know, still some of the most productive areas off the coast, but would have some of the weakest upwelling winds.
Right. I think the upwelling index is not going to tell you what you need. I have to confess, I don't know how well the model does, including the Straits of Juan de Fuca and the freshwater outflow, which would be driving a lot of that part of the system. I will look into that a little bit and get back to you, Corey.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think that's just, I mean, this is more me speaking as a curious scientist than me speaking as someone who's going to be potentially fielding similar questions in front of the council next week. But given that we have a wider continental shelf off of Washington and Oregon than in some of this really intense upwelling zone off of central and northern California, I wonder if that might allow for, if moderate upwelling plus large continental shelf ends up just making for some fairly productive habitat for things like groundfish that might not be as, I mean, you know, that high upwelling and narrow continental shelf, one might just expect the ecosystem dynamics of those two options to come out somewhat differently.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you also have some semi-permanent circulation features up there that are absent in most of the rest of the coast. What do you call it? The Great Whirl or whatever you call it up there.
The Juan de Fuca eddy?
Yeah. So they're definitely, the hydrographic setup is different up there. And if I had Mike's paper right here, I could give you an answer, but I don't. Oh, but you know what? He does. Hold on one second.
While you're looking, I have a quick comment, if I may.
Please do.
This is Tom. I'm a newbie, but I have to say I'm very impressed with the presentation, the report, and for us that they're looking at it the first time, the stoplight table. I thought that was very interesting.
Great, thank you. The credit where due. The first one that was for Columbia River and Oregon coastal salmon is the one of the many legacies of our colleague Dr. Bill Peterson. His group, he developed that, and his group has maintained it. And then the smaller but no less important stoplight table for Central Valley fall Chinook is brand new and comes from a lot of careful work by the Southwest Fisheries Science Center and colleagues. And we're eager to get feedback on that because this is the first time we've had that particular table in our report. And it's more, based on feedback we got from the SSC last year, this is starting to get a little bit more into council relevant and actionable salmon stocks. And we'll certainly look for other opportunities to expand that as data and credible models become available for that. So thanks for that feedback.
You betcha.
So I think I can answer Corey's question. It looks like the upwelling model goes to 47 degrees north, so about halfway up the Washington coast. So it's not including the Straits of Juan de Fuca, but I will double check on that.
Okay, appreciate it, Toby. Yeah, and I know we were talking, Parker McCready does one of the, I don't have my head around all these models you all use, but he has one off our coast, and he was at a workshop some of us were at earlier. So, yeah, again, kind of just trying to understand what we're seeing here. It's not a criticism at all, but
yeah, no, but it's a good question, and I will follow up on it. And it's the model that Mike is using is the ROMS model that the University of California, Santa Cruz, Chris Edwards and team are running.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you guys know whether you'll have any time with the salmon technical team or the salmon advisory subpanel? It seemed like there were a lot of great bits of information in here for salmon folks. and things that I was thinking, ooh, I want to tell, you know, this or that colleague about this part of the report. And it just made me curious whether you're going to have some time with the salmon folks.
You have to ask Kip. He's our organizer.
Yeah, I don't think so. There always this conflict, I guess, in, you know, the March and April meetings are jam-packed for the salmon advisory bodies with the annual management process. So I don't think that Robin, the staff officer, felt that they would have the time to be able to do this, but it's my understanding.
Well, I almost wonder, well, I know, you know, this might be more work for Chris and Toby, but if there would be like you know, consideration given to just a shorter form with a heavy salmon focus, because it seems like, yeah, at any rate, I just think there's a lot of great stuff in here. Everything from Streamflow to stoplight tables, that might be useful.
Yeah, I would second that. You know, I think, well, I don't know if Tim, if he's on or not, but, you know, most of us aren't of the salmon world. Is not our focus. For example, your Simon question, a couple of our guys just came, my cube neighbors came by and asked them if they had heard of it, and kind of gave me a kind of answer. But I don't know if we on this group have the expertise to answer these. But yeah, engaging with the salmon folks, if possible, would have the same thought as Yvonne. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in here. I would presume would be of interest to both sides.
Yeah, I forgot that, this is Chris Harvey. I forgot that I'm sharing my screen with everybody, so I apologize for pausing just a second ago to check my email, but I saw that I was actually looking to see if I'd gotten any emails from folks that I know are on the call, and I see that Will Satterthwaite had sent Toby and me an email that also says that there's some information in here that on salmon that there might be some especially the Central Valley salmon, we are going to need to distinguish between wild and hatchery, and potentially some lumping all systems into under the heading of Central Valley invites some other questions about particular stocks that that probably the more discussion we have with salmon focused folks in the council process, the better will be before we get in front of the council and start, you know, making generalizations based on indicators that don't have at least some supportive information behind them. But,
okay.
Yeah, I guess
so
it'll just depend on what our candidates are like.
Does anyone have any other questions for Chris or Toby before we maybe talk briefly about the questions they have for us?
Yeah, I got another one, but if I'll pause to see if someone else wants to turn.
This is Tom. I also have a couple, but I'm happy to go after Corey.
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
One was just a general comment that was kind of, I think, noted before, that it seems like a lot of the indicators are very California or Southern Oregon focused. And I'm based out of Washington, so have some concerns about geographic extent and recognize that some of this might reflect data availability. But if it is a data availability thing, that might be something raised for council, just to, that we need to start making greater efforts to increase monitoring up north. And then for dissolved oxygen, as note that you focus primarily on the Newport line for data when there are other data there is other data and data products. Something I work with a fair bit is from the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, where they have a mooring program with 20 years of data. It's only put out during the summer, but it does illustrate the hypoxia off the Washington shelf quite clearly, and would be quite useful to put in there, because like the figures you show make it look like hypoxia is fairly isn't all that severe and or long-lived, whereas on the Washington Shelf it's been quite severe and long-lived especially over the past few years. And then the other one was on habitat compression. One was just a comment that the name might be a bit misleading, since that can refer to a number of issues as compared to like upwelling or thermal habitat compression. So just a observation. But and this is something I may have missed earlier, but why is that calculation just restricted to the kind of northern or central California rather than looking at areas further up and down the coast more broadly? And I'll slow down there.
I will have to, on that last one, I will have to ask the author of the paper that's based on.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
I would imagine at least a good chunk of that is because, Toby, correct me if I'm wrong, but definitely one of the main impetus for that that paper was the recent issues of whale entanglement and habitat compression of the upwelling zone as a proximate cause of whale entanglement. And the bulk of the observations anyway of whale entanglement have been in the area where the index was calculated. And so it's at least fair to assume that that indicator is one that could be expanded to other parts of the coast, but the focal issue was contained in that portion of the coast.
Okay, thanks for that. I know for whale entanglement, at least a few of the whales that were, or some of the gear that was identified did come from fishing grounds further north. So even though the whales were rescued or not down in California, they became entangled further up and wound up dragging gear to the south. So just yeah, if you can expand, if in the future that could be expanded, that'd be great. We can look at areas that are at risk as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the other big conversation piece that we at the IEA team need to have around that particular index is what of the many ecological interactions that are going on out there this index is directly relevant to, and which ones we wouldn't want to attribute, what responses we wouldn't want to attribute to habitat compression, just because it's an intriguing new indicator. We definitely want to make sure that there's a plausible mechanistic connection.
Hi, this is John Ugoretz. Could I ask a question?
Please.
Just looking at past reports in the supplemental materials, there was a lot of detail, including things like Cal coffee indicators on forage species abundance. Is that going to be there as supplemental materials again this year?
Like time series of larval fish biomass, is that what you're talking about, John?
Yeah, there was, I'm looking at, I don't know which year I'm looking at here, but it was like table G3 on larval sardine and larval anchovy, larval hake time series.
I believe that is in this year's, yes. Let me just pull that up real quick. I'm gonna mute myself just for a second here and I'll pull it up real quick.
I think it's G2.
Yeah, this is Kit. Just note that the supplemental materials is listed in the briefing materials as IEA Team Report 2.
Yeah, and it is, it looks like, John, it looks like it's appendix, you're talking about Cal Coffee region, right? It's going to be,
yes.
It'll be supplement, it'll be appendix G, section G3. So yeah, there's all of the updated time series of larval sardine, anchovy, hake, et cetera.
Great, thanks so much.
You bet.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions of the report before we start thinking about Chris and Hilly's questions?
This is Mike Berner.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just going back to the salmon advisory folks, Robin and I grappled with that a lot. Kit, as he mentioned, they are busy in their first day or so before this hits the council floor, so we couldn't find time for a full presentation. And also, we're interested in preventing Chris and Toby from having to repeat their presentations over and over. So we've encouraged salmon folks to attend this webinar. Looks like that plan might not have worked out too well looking at the participant list, but we're also encouraging them to sit in on the council session the morning it hits the council floor to hear the report. If there's specific questions or items that the IEA team would like to engage with those groups, although it's a busy salmon meeting, they often have some downtimes, particularly advisory subpanelists are waiting for some results on salmon modeling. So there might be opportunities there for some engagement if that's desired.
Yeah, this is Corey again. I think if that's possible, I think that would be a good idea. But I did have one more question, but I can also wait for the meeting if you want to move on.
I'll just follow up on Mike's comment real quickly. And someone mentioned this earlier. In the past, when we've met with the SAS and the technical team, we've definitely tailored the presentation to focus on salmon specific indicators, so that if they did want to meet, but it was a very compressed time period, we could accommodate.
I appreciate that. I'll work with Robin. Maybe we can figure something out there.
Okay, so Corey, did you have one last question?
Yeah, I've got 5, but I'll try to stick it to one, and this one's for Chris. And we've probably asked you this multiple times in the past, but on your groundfish status summary slide, so you're not that one. On that one, you know, you have is the relative fishing intensity, that's just for the last year you have available, so it's just a 1-year event type thing?
I'm gonna have to go back, and this is always a challenge for me, because this gets into, I think for each one of, not for each one of these, but for some of these stocks, that relative fishing intensity is calculated with different proxies than others, just depending on how data rich the assessment is. But I think this takes into account the most recent year of data relative to the start of the assessment data time series, but I'd have to go back and look. But yeah, I do think this represents the most recent assessed year, yes. So
Okay,
it is something of a
comment,
but it's also is because they're groundfish stocks, you know, and they're so long lived, and their populations change somewhat less stochastically than some of the other stocks. You know, there's perhaps a little bit of inertia in these estimates.
Yeah, well, I guess, and I was thinking, funny enough, to a comment you made back at one of our workshops this past month about some of these rockfish being slow lane species. And so the whole report really is the theme of most of your indicators is showing trends over time. And so what I'm thinking, trying to express my thought here, is that your x-axis, your relative stock status, is the product, is the effect of many years of your y-axis. So, like, I was kind of surprised to see rough eye and green stripe above that line, and that line is what we use, legally speaking, to say overfishing happened. But biologically speaking, I think it doesn't make that is probably a biologically insignificant event for rough eye and green stripe. You know, if we did that continuously over time, that's when you start to see the move to the left on the x-axis, and yellow eye is below 1 there because of many years of being above 1 on the y-axis, if I'm making my point. So I don't know if you could, I always feel like asking you all to do more, but you do so much, but you could throw a dimension of size or whatever on to do some kind of multi-year average of relative fishing intensity. That might be more biologically, for this set of species, biologically more appropriate. But again, just a kind of small picture comment there.
Okay, that's super helpful, Corey. And I think maybe the best approach for me at first would be to talk with Jason Cope and others that are assessment authors. But I do believe the way that you interpreted it is correct, that this could, for example, with rough eye or green stripe, this could represent just a recent and subtle hiccup in data that, because it crossed a threshold, regulatory threshold, does make it seem perhaps weightier than it actually is, but I should talk with him. And then as far as a way to present data like these, where we have so many species summarized in one plot, that would probably involve developing some other kind of plot that was at the individual species level, which is possible. It would just require a little bit of forethought given the various constraints on the report. But thanks for that input.
No, thank you. And yeah, again, always asking an extra mile out of you people. So I feel bad, but thank you.
I had a similar thought to Corey on the changes over time, and was while I was listening to your report, I was thinking, I wonder if they could just show this same graph from a few years ago and then show the current graph so that we could kind of see movement over time, if there is any. But yeah, I don't know if that would be useful or not.
We can do that. It would just we'd have to be selective about it, because it would look like a spider web if we had too many species on there. I mean, some like the flatfish out there in the lower right corner aren't going to change much at all, which is, you know, that becomes somewhat superfluous. But for things like widow and sablefish and some of the species that have been under rebuilding plans over the last decade or so, we could do something selective like that. If it'd be good to just define what our intent is there, because I don't know how much that would be redundant with information that's already known in the council family from more groundfish FMP focused presentations and documents, but we could certainly do that.
Okay, so it's 4:15. Can we just, do you mind going to that question slide, please, Chris? We need to be conscious that we need to keep some time before our 4:30 adjournment to discuss the Climate and Communities Initiative. But let's see, if we have ecosystem work group, if you have anything right now on indicators that should be dropped from the report, maybe if it's dropped from the report, that would be something that we could put in our written report. But if you have any comments on stuff that you might think could stay in the report but doesn't need to be provided in the presentation, Toby and Chris, would it be okay if folks emailed you on that?
Yes.
That's fine with me, yeah.
Okay, just
so y'all looking for, excuse me, sorry, Ivana, but clarification, you're looking for changes for next year, or just for your full presentation to the council, the presentation to the full council?
Either or. I mean, it would be good to qualify if you do give a suggestion of what you're specifically thinking about. I mean, just off the top of my head, we just gave a 1-hour presentation that we prefer to be in the 35 to 40-minute neighborhood. So again, it was the first time. But if there was stuff in here that you thought, we got it the first time and you gave it 4 times, or that's not really that important, or if you missed it from previous years, that would be great to know in the short term, like between like sometime by week's end, or by no later than, say, end of the day Monday. If there's other bigger picture things, you can just specify that and get it to us at your convenience.
Okay, thank you. And then just sort of working our way backwards up these bullet points. Thiamine deficiency in juvenile salmon. Can you talk to us a bit about that? I know I've heard internally there's a concern for that central northern California area, but is this something that the council needs to worry about this year? And so what were you thinking about thiamine deficiency?
Well, I think we were wondering if it was something that the council was already worried about, and if we didn't talk about it, were we getting asked about it? Nate Mantua has provided Toby and me with some really helpful talking points. Our initial inclination, because neither one of us are, vitamin physiologists or anything like that, was to not overstate this and to not comment on it unless asked about it. Just because we're not experts on it, and because right now I don't know if they have a very clear smoking gun as to where the thiamine deficiency is originating. But really, I think we were just looking to hear from you, because we have had our heads down on getting the report ready. If this is something that is broadly being discussed, and if we should be prepared. If so, we can be prepared for it. It was really more just looking for guidance. And John Ugaretz, maybe if you're still on and you want to weigh on that too, I mean, that would be helpful.
I would add
that
it's interesting in the aspect of what it might mean about the diets for the salmon. The salmon were eating predominantly anchovies, which the original speculation was that was the source of the deficiency, but now they're not sure. So there is as Chris said, they haven't quite identified a smoking gun. So maybe we should just stay away from it.
It has the feeling of something that is super interesting right now, but maybe not something to focus on, but I'm not sure. So would defer. If there are folks on the call who are very salmon focused, please do speak up. Okay, then the top bullet, boy, that's an interesting one.
Well, BOEM has set aside 3 areas along the West Coast, 2 off California, 1 off Oregon, for potential wind farms. These would be floating wind farms, so they'd be offshore. But Chris and I debated whether to show the groundfish slide or not, and I thought maybe we should show it, because I'm not sure right now whether those 4 areas coincide much with some of the areas where the bottom dragging is done. So the other reason is that the East Coast is getting absolutely slaughtered by wind farms. It'll never be the same problem on the West Coast, but one of the things we want to do is make sure the council stays ahead of it if it does become an issue.
Yeah, well.
Thank you. Go ahead, Corey.
Well, I was just going to say, I think someone like Tommy and myself and some others have been involved with that up in Washington. That I would coincidentally, maybe there's the last item on Wednesday, March 4th, is about the marine planning update. People are coming to the council to talk about that and how the notifications work. I don't know exactly how it works everywhere, but there's now a West Coast Ocean Alliance, I think it's called, and we thought about it really hard up here in Washington and how it might work. And the council did have a representative, or does, on this coastwide regional planning body, which is no longer called that, and I'm forgetting all the terms. So there is, I guess, if you're around on Wednesday, the end of Wednesday, it's a brief update, and I'm not sure exactly what it'll be, but that's kind of one of the general topics that has been discussed under marine planning.
So this is one of those slides that I could imagine if we were looking to cut corners on the total length of the presentation. This is one that you know, because it doesn't change a lot from year to year, and we haven't necessarily linked it mechanistically to anything, it's one that I would have thought, well, you know, do we keep that one or not? And here's a really good context for whether we do or don't keep it. And I mean, I would definitely want to keep this this one in the presentation in future years as changes in, say, the rockfish conservation areas and other open and closed bottom trawl sites has changed. But for this year, I wasn't really sure. But on the other hand, if we did want to include, you know, rectangles where some of the proposed wind farm areas are, we could do that, unless that's unnecessarily provocative. I mean, I don't want to cause a, you know, a ruckus or anything like that. But on the other hand, I mean, this is just being objective about where these things are occurring versus where some proposed wind sites might be. But I realize that showing a slide with information like that creates work for someone, and I don't, you know, I don't know what the best approach here is.
So maybe for this agenda item, for the ecosystem status report, those maps don't need to go up, is my initial thought. But maybe the ecosystem work group could review the briefing book materials and consider commenting on the marine planning update, if that would be useful. I don't know if Mike Berner is still on the call, but if so, Mike, if the council staff already have some plans for thinking about offshore wind energy, that might be helpful to hear. And then we, the ecosystem work group, should sort of think about that, particularly with regard to Chapter 5 of the Fishery Ecosystem Plan.
Yeah, this is Mike. As Corey mentioned, the council's going to hear an update from Karen Braby regarding marine planning efforts and what's going on with that regard. Additionally, the Habitat Committee works with BOEM on, at least to a limited extent, on some of the proposals and area sightings and such. So those are the two avenues that the council hears from the most. One of the things we're going to ask the council about under this marine planning agenda item at the March council meeting is how they want to move forward. Is this marine planning update in that body still adequate? Is the Habitat Committee the appropriate place to take some of this stuff up, or do we need to envision a different process that works on marine planning and the siting of some of these locations? So the question's very timely and something the council will discuss in March, so it might be worthwhile for some of you folks, if you're around, to sit in on the last agenda item of the first day of the council session.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike, and thanks, Chris and Toby, for bringing this up. I think it's mainly for us just a helpful heads up. Okay, so without any further ado, how about if we move into our last agenda item for today, which is the Climate and Communities Initiative. And let's see, Kit, do you want to set us up for where you think we are in the process? And then before you do, I'm just going to let folks from the public know that in the ecosystem work group, we have sort of multiple levels of participation in the Climate and Communities Initiative. There are a few of us, myself, Corey Niles, and Tom Moore, who are also on the Climate and Communities core team. And then there are other folks like Travis Buck, who were at the January workshop, and then other folks like Jessica Watson and Tim Copeland, who were not at the January workshop. So we had some back and forth via email about how the ecosystem work group might want to proceed, and we're going to talk about that today. But one of our goals is going to be to try to respect the differences in sort of involvement and perspective, and make sure that we are taking into account the sense of where the process is from the folks who were less involved in the workshop, because we think that that perspective will sort of better reflect where most members of the public are on this. So with that, Kit, if you want to go ahead and talk about what we should be, where we are on this agenda item.
Sure. So I think as all of the folks on the work group know, and several of you participated in the workshop at the end of January, the outcome of that was some prospective scenarios, I think, and those are going to be presented to the council in March. So there is a workshop report in the advanced briefing book, and I expect that Jonathan Starr, the facilitator / consultant, will present that information to the council under G3. And so it's sort of, where do we go from here? Jonathan, also submitted a second report. Will be supplemental attachment 2 under G3, which are some ideas for, some sort of focus group meetings that could be where this is taken further, and what kinds of questions would be asked, and so on. So that's kind of the setting. I think is really the council reviewing what the output of the workshop is, taking in any input from advisory bodies on their view of those scenarios that were developed through that workshop, and any proposed refinements to them, and then some guidance on what future activities should we do to complete this process, I guess you could say. And really it's sort of taking those and working out the questions around sort of I guess what I've been calling the strategic planning questions around, okay, under these alternative realities, what are some responses, and what types of responses look like they might be more robust under different sets of conditions. And then specifically for the ecosystem work group and also the ecosystem advisory subpanel, if you've looked at your agenda, I structured on the beginning and the late morning of the first day of your meeting, kicking off with a joint session between the ecosystem work group and the advisory subpanel, and just sort of getting into this, and then having the two groups break out. And I know that the work group has already had some ideas and some interest in maybe trying to progress the details of the scenarios that were developed, but I guess you could sort of preview or think at this stage about what you might want to do during that time, and how that would feed into a report to the council. And also I mentioned that Jonathan will be there and will be planning to engage with the groups during those sessions, so he'll be a resource there as well. So anyways, that's kind of where things are. I hope that made sense.
Yes, thank you, Kit. So I asked Jessica if she'd be willing to talk a little bit about some of her thoughts on where we could go with this at this meeting, and so I was going to put her on the spot and see if she wanted to summarize for us.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. Mostly I was looking at it, as you said, as a perspective of someone who did not attend the workshop, and just reading the report that was provided. And it really seemed that, you know, as Kit was talking about, that the whole idea of this workshop and that this phase in the council process is to really present these scenarios and really solidify them, and then also come up with a way to facilitate future conversations with regards to specific species, those that are, you know, managed as well as not managed under the different FMPs. And so I just was wondering what our working group's goal was and what would be most beneficial moving forward in this process at this phase, and whether it was to really look at those matrices that were provided and provide feedback about how each quadrant or, you know, quadrant of that matrix relates to the different scenarios, and provide feedback on if anything's missing, or if there's any overlap, kind of to shape those future FMP managed and non-managed species specific discussions. And so that's kind of where my thought process was going on, looking at maybe the scenarios in respect to how best to facilitate those. But it sounds like also Jonathan will be providing some recommendations, so to maybe consider those as well in our discussion. But mostly to make sure that we feel like the scenarios are appropriate and that nothing's being missed, or there isn't like a big gaping hole in a scenario, was kind of my thought process on where we might be providing feedback in this next phase.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone I think that's a reasonable place to start, but I wanted to sort of hear from the ecosystem work group about whether they have other thoughts about where we're going next for this as the ecosystem work group.
This is Corey again. I think Jessica's got the gist of what the group should be doing. I mean, Yvonne, Tommy, and I are on the core planning team. I don't think we've not really had a discussion on. We had a discussion of what happened and did a report on what happened, but I don't know that we've really discussed about where to go next. And I think all interested people should be, including the ecosystem working group, commenting from their point of view where to go next. So I think definitely what I would hope to hear from this advisory body and others.
And I would just add that it seems like it'd be useful, at least from my perspective, on the team, to hear how the team members who did attend the workshop, how they felt, that matrix went, and then what different ways in which, like, is that a useful tool? How could it be altered to become a more useful tool for to facilitate these future discussions? Or is there a better way to move forward and maybe not use the matrix, perhaps?
So this is Kit, and yeah, I'm thinking. Unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of because of schedules and so on, a lot of opportunity to kind of talk to Jonathan about what he has some ideas of how he could help out in terms of when we get together in Rohnert Park and during that session. And I don't know if those necessarily match what at least the ecosystem work group is interested in doing. But as I mentioned, the idea is sort of to kick off in this joint meeting with the advisory subpanel, and that might be a chance to at least sort of take stock and review the results of the workshop. I know for those of you who are at the workshop, that might feel a little tedious, but it might be a good way of sort of getting oriented and maybe get some ideas out there. And then when the groups break out, I would expect that maybe they would want to sort of focus on different activities potentially, and I would leave that up to the subpanel and the EWG to decide what to focus on and how to spend their time during those sessions. And then, as I mentioned, I did organize it so that then there's a reconvening at the end of the day. And so, you know, that could be a chance to just sort of get some cross-pollination and report back on what people did and so on. So that's in a very unfocused way, perhaps, the way I was thinking that session would go. And so you know, my intention was to give the two committees some flexibility in the time they want to spend in terms of what you want to focus on and what you want to do. So.
Okay, thanks, Kit. Is there anyone else from the ecosystem work group who has some ideas or thoughts on what we want to focus on at this March meeting? For this agenda item? If not, I will throw it open to see if there's anyone on the call from the Ecosystem Advisory Subpanel or other advisory bodies of the council who might have particular requests of us. Otherwise, yeah, I think we have at least a big plan, partly just to let Jonathan do his thing in the morning, but also as Jessica and Corey had sort of outlined, you know, think about the overall process, think about the matrices that we saw, maybe whether they're useful to where we hope the initiative is going in the future. You know, I think there had been some discussion with Jonathan about maybe filling out some of those matrices more, but I don't know if we're going to be getting to that or if the ecosystem work group is even the right group. So I just wanted to sort of throw this open if other folks had requests for us in particular.
Yvonne, I have a question too, like it's more basic to Kit about how this information is being presented to the other advisory bodies.
Oh, good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. We always struggle with the timing of stuff, and I have to say that I'm not sure that the other advisory bodies have really set aside time to take this up. I need to circle back with some of my coworkers and confirm whether, you know, what's been scheduled on their agendas. And I think to the degree that they have set aside time, I would take it upon myself to go and speak with those advisory bodies. I did, you know, this idea that the EWG, I think, has done in the past. I don't know how if entirely successful, but having sort of a time on your agenda where you would have sort of an open house to encourage other members of or representatives from other advisory bodies to come in, and you would be available to answer questions of them. And I scheduled that time on the second day of your meeting, the Thursday the 5th, in the afternoon for about an hour and a half. So that would also be an opportunity for representatives, or if a whole advisory body decided unlikely to show up, then engage with the EWG and get some information and so on.
What?
It looks like the HMS team's not even meeting. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, we had discussed our having an open house of sorts to talk about the fishery ecosystem plan update. Since that is a primary obligation of the ecosystem work group, but the ecosystem work group is not managing the climate and communities initiative. So I guess maybe I missed that you were thinking we would have an open house on that as well.
Well, I guess I wasn't sure, and I didn't specify anything on the agenda. It just says
Okay.
to discuss ecosystem agenda items. So if
Okay.
you don't feel like you're that's an appropriate way to cover the scenario planning process or the Climate and Communities Initiative, then you can not get into that, I guess. But yeah, it's pretty.
Kit, am I right in the outline of the time frame is that this is really March is to solidify the scenarios, so it's trying to gain feedback on that, and then April through June is more the species specific conversation?
Yeah.
That could potentially be with the advisory bodies and be in a different process, whether that be webinars or specific outreach efforts.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. And
Thank
so
you.
there's some concepts that Jonathan has put forward that'll be in a supplementary paper, but that's just fodder for, advisory bodies and whoever, and the council, of course, to come up with where do we go from here. So I think obviously that will be helpful would be helpful to the council for the ecosystem work group and other advisory bodies to weigh in on that. And sort of, I don't know that in March we'll be able to get down to, let's have a webinar on April 27th that will involve the following people, but, get something more focused than sort of high level concepts. And I will mention we do have, I've pulled the Climate and Communities core team, and looked like March 20th in the morning was the best time in terms of availability for that group to have a webinar. And I thought that would be an opportunity as well for to review, take what comes out in terms of council guidance, and for that group to also do any additional specific planning that is needed. So that'll be another step there as needed.
Well, looking at I think the best not the best, but I think a likely outcome is it's going to be us and the EAS giving feedback that the core team will then take into account. The HMS teams and advisors to panels aren't even meeting until the day that's on the agenda, Saturday. I don't know if this is on the GMT and GAPS radar. Everyone just talking about how busy the salmon folks are.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And yeah, it was hard to set up a way for the core team per se to sort of, as a body, provide recommendations. So I think what I've suggested in emails and so on is that since there's this very large overlap between that group and the membership of the EAS and the EWG, that obviously it's not a consolidated set of recommendations from a single body, but those two groups would be sort of your reports and recommendations would be the way that those recommendations are going to get to the council, I think. So.
I forgot the Habitat Committee. It probably will have opportunity to being there early.
Yeah, and bear in mind that the workshop did have representation from the other advisory bodies We explicitly invited somebody from each of them, and then I think between that and other overlaps, I know there were, I think, a couple people from the Habitat Committee that participated in the workshop, for example. So hopefully those people can sort of carry the water, if you will, for those advisory bodies to the degree they want to and are able to weigh in on this topic.
Okay, well, thanks, folks. I think, mainly my hope for today was just that we could have a little bit of an organizing discussion, which I think we have. And then just want to do a final check to see if there's anyone else from the public who wanted to comment on how we might deal with this agenda item at the council meeting next week. But then I wanted a few minutes to wrap up so we can talk about our sort of last scheduled items for between now and when we see each other in person. So final opportunity for folks who are not on the EWG to comment on this or any other agenda item or share random ideas. Okay, so just to close up and make sure we're all on the same page for the ecosystem work group, between, oh gosh, now in the next couple of days, I want to try to tidy up the work group report for the fishery ecosystem plan so that we can get that in the supplemental briefing book, and our job at the council meeting will just be to be available for any questions on that. So in terms of, reporting, unless there's some strong urge to add another supplemental report, let's consider this maybe our last report on the agenda item will be the outline of the remaining chapters, which will include questions for the council and suggestions for schedule. Then on the California Current Ecosystem and Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Report, we will, we usually provide some technical comments on things that we liked or, changes we might like to see in the future. Tommy's coordinating that, so please make sure that you spend time looking at the report and reading through the appendices and whatnot before we get together next week. It sounds like we might have some time to ask Chris and Dobie questions if we have them, but let's try to be sort of advanced prepared on that. So if anything occurred to you today about any of the indicators that were discussed, send the group an email and I'll try to add that up to our supplemental report, which we can finalize at the meeting. So we have to do it pretty quick because that agenda item is up early. And then the last, we'll probably spend the bulk of our time as in person working on the Climate and Communities Initiative and our report out on that agenda item. And it sounds like we should also think the marine planning update was a comment that was early in the council agenda. If it is, we should probably take a look at that. Yeah.
It's the first day we're there, Yvonne.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. So let's at least have some folks could at least skim that. That is C2, and let's think about, do some independent thinking about, well, all right, what do we want to comment on, if any, and then if we feel like we need to, we can throw together a report sort of on our first day on that agenda item C2. Does that sound like a fair summary of our tasks?
Yeah, I would mention, you mentioned about spending time on the Climate and Communities Initiative. Although that first day has time blocked out for that, I think there'll be a good chance that you'll have time on the following 2 days if you want to work on that some more and revisit that. So really, there is not just that session on the first day to work on that. So just think you'll
So
have.
I'm sorry, Kit, could you possibly throw up our agenda for next week on the screen? I realize
Yeah.
it might take some scrambling.
Yeah, hold on a second. I can do that. Just let me close some things and get to that file. Okay, so are you now? I think you should be
There we
seeing.
go. We're seeing the ecosystem workgroup report. If you could just scroll down a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, let me do that. I'll make it a little smaller here. And okay. So basically that's the first day. So as I mentioned, you have that session at 9 o'clock, and we can work with Chris and Toby if they can come in. I know I had scheduled them also with the Ecosystem Advisory Subpanel that morning, so we'll have to work around that. But we can probably figure something out there. And then, as I mentioned, the balance of the day is on the Climate and Communities Initiative, and it's this mix of joint session and breakout. And obviously, if you want to spend more time on your own, you can do that, I'm sure.
Okay, well, we might, we're often pretty casual with one of the very first agenda items, which is reviewing the agenda. And but maybe we can be a little more deliberate about making sure that we have some time on that first day to, because I'm a little bit concerned. Is Wednesday, March 4th? When does the council hear the ecosystem status report?
First thing on Thursday.
Okay, all right.
So you have, you'll need to get your report done on Wednesday. You know, probably you want to wrap that up and before you get too focused on other stuff.
Is that your way of admitting that you only gave us an hour to do that?
Yes. I guess I was under the misimpression that this was not a high priority, but I guess I was wrong. So that in terms of reporting on it. So.
All right. Well, we'll do what we can, but we might that EWG discussion period of 1 to 3 p.m. on Wednesday, we might be scrambling to get some other stuff done. So, okay. We'll do what we can. All right. Does anyone else have anything, objections, complaints, ideas? All righty. Well, then, thank you everyone for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks. I'm going to end the meeting. Bye.